The Battle of Ligny was a ferocious head-to-head clash during which the French army, commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte, drove back the Prussian army led by Marshal Blucher. It was fought on the second day of Napoleon's invasion into Belgium. His goal was to split up and knock out the closest two enemy armies of the European Seventh Coalition. Each of the nations in the alliance were assembling their armies in preparation for their own planned invasion of France, to commence in July of 1815. The Allied leaders once again sought to remove Napoleon from power. Meanwhile, 5 miles northwest, the Duke of Wellington, who had collected half of his Anglo-Allied army at the crossroads of Quatre Bras, had tenaciously foiled Marshal Ney, who commanded the left wing of the French army, which was unsuccessful in its attempt to capture the strategic location. On the morning of the 17th, Napoleon made his first major blunder in the campaign. He failed to initiate a rapid pursuit of the badly beaten Prussians, allowing them time to reorganize and conduct an orderly retreat. Napoleon's second, and arguably just as disastrous mistake, was diverting 1/3 of his army, commanded by Marshal Grouchy, to follow up, at a distance, behind the retiring Prussians, seen moving north and east. As a result, the French main army, commanded by Napoleon, was weakened, being deprived of 2 entire infantry corps, and 2 cavalry corps, given to Grouchy. Finally, by early afternoon, Napoleon spurred into swift action, and redirected his troops to join Marshal Ney at Quatre Bras. He then launched a close and vigorous chase, on the heels of the fighting retreat of the Duke of Wellington's rearguard, which protected the Anglo-Allied army as it retreated north, to avoid being cut off, and then destroyed by the superior French forces. Napoleon's ultimate plan was to capture Brussels, the Belgian capital. He believed that capturing the city would persuade the Seventh Coalition leaders to initiate peace negotiations, especially if the populations of the Low Countries, in the Flanders region, rose up to support such a French triumph. By late evening, Wellington's army had skillfully evaded the pursuing French, with Napoleon seen leading the chase. The Duke halted his army's fighting retreat, and took up battle positions along an extensive ridge, just 2 miles south of the village of Waterloo. In front of them, the pursuing French advance guard took no further action, as the rest of their army gradually came up, and prepared to camp for the night. Amid this frantic drama, since the afternoon and going into the night, an immense downpour of torrential rains completely saturated the region, along with all the soldiers and horses who were helplessly exposed in the open, miserably trudging along waterlogged roads, and trying to find crude shelters in mud-filled fields, while almost every man and beast in both armies were practically half-starved. The army's supply wagons could not keep up with the rapidly unfolding events and troop movements. The rain-soaked veterans among the 140,000 troops, struggling to get some sleep, silently predicted an epic and grim battle would be fought the next day, and some, expecting the worst, wrote their final farewell letters to loved ones. In contrast, Napoleon was eager for the battle. "Now I have them, these English," he smugly declared. By dawn of June the 18th, the misery of incessant rains had abated. The clouds and light drizzle heralded better weather was ahead for the day. Napoleon was more than pleased to see that Wellington's army had remained in place, instead of trying to escape overnight. His own army was still stretched out at this time, and not ready for an early start to the battle. For this reason, and the fact that the muddy ground was unsuitable for fighting in, Napoleon was content to delay starting the battle. He had breakfast with his generals, at the inn of La Caillou, where he characteristically boasted of an impending great victory, and being in Brussels by nightfall. Napoleon scoffed at Wellington's army, and even chastised the cautionary comments that his generals were daring to present. By mid-morning, Napoleon reviewed his troops, in a memorable ride upon his white horse, once they had taken up their final battle positions. The French soldiers were overjoyed when they saw their leader, and cheered out loud, "Long live the Emperor." At the same time, their regimental bands played stirring military tunes. Napoleon, the great military mind of his time, could not conceive, in his omnipotence at that moment, that anything could go wrong. Napoleon's battle plan commenced at 11:30 in the morning, with a furious diversionary attack against Wellington's right flank, upon the defended chateau grounds of Fougommon, which was led by his brother, Jérôme, the commander of an elite French infantry division. The dramatic assault eventually stalled, but it succeeded in drawing much of Wellington's infantry brigade reserves to reinforce the threatened area by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was at this moment Napoleon was startled to learn that the Prussian army, which was previously believed to have been neutralized and retreating miles away, was in fact heading towards the battlefield. Napoleon now realized he had walked into a trap. Though, in the previous 24 hours, the armies of Wellington and Blucher were in full retreat, heading north on separate parallel routes, both commanders and their general staffs had plotted a risky gambit. According to plan, Wellington's army was to stand its ground and defensively pin Napoleon's army in battle, while most of the Prussian army, almost 10 miles away, would turn west and join the action, crashing into Napoleon's eastern flank. The ultimate ambitious aim being to squeeze Napoleon's army in vice and utterly destroy it once and for all. Napoleon, still hopeful for victory, remained committed to continue the battle against Wellington. Throughout the day, Napoleon and Marshal Ney directed massive troop assaults of French infantry and then cavalry across Wellington's battle position. All the while, the French artillery was continuously bombarding the Allied army's emaciated front line, where casualties and battlefield desertions accumulated in high tolls. Most of Wellington's reserves were plugged into the front lines by early evening. His situation became desperate, and the French commanders knew it. In the meantime, Napoleon directed many of his own reserves to face off against the Prussians closing in on his eastern flank. By evening, halfway into the battle, Marshal Blucher's leading brigades of the Prussian 4th Corps began attacking Count Lobau's French 6th Corps that had been sent to block them. The Prussians steadily pushed back their adversaries, pressing on for over a mile towards the French centre. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the battle in this sector then raged around the village of Plancenoit. Here, dead bodies from both sides quickly piled up, amid grim and no quarter close combat street fighting. Napoleon was distracted by the threat, now worsening behind his right flank. Prussian cannonballs dropped amid his central battle positions. He had to act quickly and decisively. He still had most of his Imperial Guard infantry available. A French victory was at hand against Wellington, when at around 6:30 in the evening, the German-held, formidable farmhouse position of Lycent, in front of the Allied army's centre, was finally captured by the French. Shortly thereafter, French infantry, supported by cavalry and artillery, began bleeding Wellington's centre dry, which seemed moments away from completely breaking wide open. Marshal Ney saw it, and sent messages to Napoleon, begging for more troops at that critical moment. Ney's desperate request for a few infantry to finish off Wellington was outrightly refused by Napoleon. He exclaimed, exasperated, "What? Where does he think I can find them?" At the very moment, the Prussians were arriving in greater numbers and making gains in the fight raging in and around the village of Plancenoit. Napoleon committed his Young Guard division into that action to stave off the collapse of his right flank. By 7 o'clock, Napoleon had managed to temporarily stump the Prussian assaults by throwing at them just 2 of his old Guard infantry battalions. The stunning shock attack launched by these veteran French guardsmen pushed back the humbled Prussians a mile beyond the contested village. More than satisfied, Napoleon then returned his focus back to defeating Wellington. But in the previous 30 minutes of breathing space, while the French had failed to exploit their advantage in the center of the battlefield, Wellington personally rode up and down across his front line, supervising the stabilization of his weary troops and redeploying his last reserves to effectively bolster his weakened sectors. At 7:30 in the evening, as the sun began to set, Napoleon personally led forward the remaining reserves of his Imperial Guard infantry in a final, all-or-nothing attack to destroy Wellington's center. The last slim chance for the French to be victorious had now arrived. Napoleon deployed his old guard in tactical and strategical reserve positions amid the center and rear of his army. He then left Marshal Ney to lead forward his 4 middle guard infantry regiments against Wellington's center. Napoleon then returned to his forward headquarters position, next to the Inn of La Belle Alliance, to survey the attack of the middle guard veterans, which was accompanied by a battery of horse artillery of the guard. With the bravest of the brave, Marshal Ney at their head, the veteran Imperial Guards steadily marched up the muddy hill of Mons and Shun, in square formations. Dead Frenchmen lay all around them. The wounded ones cheered them on. Cannon fire smashed into their ranks. But they carried on, as if unstoppable. French soldiers across the front line were in high spirits. Napoleon's messengers were racing among their ranks, telling them that Marshal Grouchy and his troops had just arrived on the battlefield, and were attacking the Prussians. But Napoleon had deceived his troops. Feeling no guilt, he sent out messengers to race across the French front line, to excitedly spread the false rumor of Marshal Grouchy just joining the battle. In reality, Grouchy was just starting his own action, 8 miles away, attacking the Prussian rearguard, consisting of the 3rd Corps, commanded by General Thielmann, which was defending bridges over the river Diehl, in and around the town of Wavre. Napoleon, observing his middle guard attack, advancing against Wellington, was suddenly taken aback. His attack plan he desired, was supposed to be one compact mass of his guard battalions, striking Wellington's weak center. But he saw the attack, altered in mid-stride. Instead, the battalions had spread themselves out, to attack in a line, across Wellington's right flank, which lay in wait, behind the summit of the Mons and Shun plateau. The final assault of the French Imperial Guard struck the Anglo-Allied line as separated entities, with none supporting each other. There was some initial success. Parts of the defensive line did momentarily fall back. But, within 15 minutes of very tenacious fighting by both sides, all the French guardsmen were overwhelmed by the Allied defenders. Napoleon observed the calamity, as he saw the remains of Wellington's army actually launch a general attack across the valley. Wellington's advance, alongside the Prussians overwhelming the French right flank at the same time, led to the complete disintegration of Napoleon's army. Wellington and Blucher pushed their armies forward to complete their pincer attack strategy and crush the helpless French army. Abandoning their cannons, muskets, and wagons, the mass of French fugitives were chased by Allied and Prussian cavalry as they headed southwards along the main road, back to France. Many, who were expecting Marshal Grouchy to save the battle, realized the deception and, most ran for their lives. Napoleon realized the catastrophic reality of that moment, and said, "All is lost. It is time for us to retire." Among the last French defenders, still offering a brave show of resistance, were several battalion squares of the fearsome Old Guard, who were conducting slow, but impressive, fighting retreats. They blasted out deadly volleys, to keep away Allied attackers who unwisely dared to charge at them. At times they even fired at their own countrymen, who were mostly berserk fugitives, mindlessly rushing upon the Old Guard, to seek their protection. After failing to rally the army, Napoleon took refuge in one of the squares of the Old Guard, together with some of his senior generals. Some infuriated Prussians, seeking to settle long-standing vendettas against their former conquerors, continued to slaughter unarmed French soldiers, even the wounded. Many of these avengers may have been seeking out Napoleon himself, just to take pleasure in lynching him on the spot. At around 9:30 p.m., perhaps only just 400 or 500 yards away, from where the defiant Imperial Guards were protecting Napoleon's life, the Duke of Wellington met with Marshal Blucher, amid the ongoing horrors around them. In the gloomy dusk, both commanders congratulated each other on their historic, tremendous victory, while a Prussian military band played a hymn in their honor. Only the sheer determination and sacrifices of the soldiers and officers, in both Allied armies, and the Allied commanders' devoted commitments in their risky battle plan, secured their final narrow victory. At this time, as darkness fell, Napoleon finally exited the battle in haste. The emperor became a fugitive, now rushing towards the French border, escorted by a small entourage, consisting of several of his most senior generals, and a dozen of his Imperial Guard lancers and chasseurs. His household staff, still with the imperial carriages, were left alone, to face their own fate and survival. Napoleon's group confronted a major challenge, at the nearby town of Genappe. A scene of utter chaos was unfolding, where mobs of retreating French soldiers were crammed together, trying to bypass a mass of abandoned wagons, and then cross the narrow main bridge spanning the Diehl River. Vengeful Prussians were at their heels, cutting down their victims with ease. Napoleon and his escort avoided the congestion by finding a crossing to the west of Genappe, and thereafter being unimpeded, resumed their flight, pressing forward to the crossroads of Quatre Bras, where Wellington was victorious against the French 2 days earlier. For the moment, Napoleon was safe. The Allied armies, and his own defeated fleeing army, were far behind, as was the horrific Waterloo battlefield, where 10,000 soldiers lay dead, alongside many thousands more, who were severely injured. Upon his arrival at Quatre Bras, Napoleon was disappointed to find only the army's reserve park was on the site. Also visible, under the full moon, was the macabre sight of the bodies of hundreds of dead soldiers, laying unburied since the previous battle, stripped naked by battlefield looters. Napoleon was expecting to find the French 7th Infantry Division of General Giraud on the spot. Several hours earlier, Marshal Soult had sent orders to their last known position, near the battlefield of Ligny, for the commander, Colonel Maty, to redeploy at Quatre Bras. Because the division had suffered heavy casualties, and the loss of its commander, General Giraud, it had been left behind to recuperate in the area. Colonel Maty received the orders, but instead chose to move the division south, and cross the French border. Napoleon did not linger. He left with his entourage, and continued on during the night, south to the town of Charleroi, reaching there at 5 o'clock in the morning. In the town's streets, scenes of disorder prevailed, as lost troops and deserters jostled along the main street, to cross the wide bridge over the river Sambre. Only 4 days earlier, the crossing had served as the main route of the triumphant French army's invasion into Belgium. Numerous wagons full of supplies and wounded, and a collection of captured Prussian cannons, were all clogging the roadways leading to the one bridge. Nevertheless, nothing could halt the swarms of defeated invaders, as they raced back to France. And there was no hesitation among them to loot any unguarded provisions in their path. In their turn, Napoleon's group waded through the mob, and eventually crossed over the congested bridge. Napoleon and his staff exited the town, and came upon some soldiers, resting at their bivouac in a meadow. Here, they all warmed themselves around a campfire. Napoleon then, strangely remarked to one of his staff officers, General Corbenot, standing beside him, "Hey monsieur, you've done a fine thing." A confused Corbenot only saluted him, and replied, "Sire, it is the utter ruin of France." Napoleon faced about, and shrugged his shoulders. He was at this time, extremely pale and haggard. He then finished off a small glass of wine and a morsel of bread, which one of his servants had produced from his pocket. For some moments, they all remained silently brooding around the campfire. Demoralized soldiers who strayed nearby, ignored all attempts to rally them, and they continued to flee. Eventually, Napoleon continued on with his escort, crossing the border into France, and finally stopping at the town of Philippeville, which they reached at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, having established a temporary headquarters, Napoleon became more self-composed, and began to bring order to the chaos surrounding him. He sent out army orders that designated new rallying points for several of his regional army commanders to fall back towards Paris. The border fortress garrisons received raised alerts. His brother, Jerome, was directed to collect that part of the army which was retreating in good order, on another route back to France, several miles to the west, at the town of Marchiennes. Napoleon dictated letters to his staff secretary Fleury, which were sent to Paris, to suppress the tensions to be expected, when news of the catastrophic defeat of the army eventually reached the city. In one of these letters to his brother, Joseph, he used overconfident rhetoric. He began the letter, "All is not lost." Other remarks bordered on fanciful imaginations. "I shall have 300,000 soldiers, with whom I can at once oppose the enemy. I will horse my artillery with carriage horses. I will raise 100,000 conscripts." Such lofty words were deemed enough to somehow downplay the fact that Napoleon had already lost half of his 125,000 soldiers, in killed, wounded, desertions, missing, and prisoners. Many thousands of his horses were killed and maimed. 200 of his cannons were captured. The numbers of his elite infantrymen and cavalry troopers were drastically reduced. The Young Guard division was almost wiped out. France faced a fiasco, which Napoleon referred to in the letter as "this horrible piece of bad luck." He then ended the message by urging Joseph to convey to the politicians that now was their time to unite and support their emperor, in order to save France. However, Napoleon knew that his current powers now existed by only a narrow margin. Only 2 months earlier, in accordance with the Charter of 1815, signed by himself and the residing French politicians, Napoleon had submitted himself to being constrained in his powers by ruling France through a constitutional agreement, sharing the rule of France with the Chamber's officials. If he now dared to cross that line, he would be regarded as a dictator, once again. He did not need more enemies to contend with. Since the beginning of June, parts of France were in open armed revolt against Napoleon. During the Waterloo campaign, a large-scale rebellion was ongoing in the Vendée region, in western France. Napoleon's enemies were no idle threat. He could not also forget his horrific experience, a year earlier in 1814, when on his way to his exile in Elba, in a 2-day period of the journey, he came close to being lynched by townspeople in the Avignon region of South France. And while on Elba, he was genuinely worried about rumors of royalist assassination plots against him. Napoleon was intent on resolving the current national crisis by negotiating with the politicians in Paris to have them fully supporting him. When all the necessary army orders had been issued, Napoleon first placed Marshal Soult in command of the scattered French army that was rallying in the area, and then took 3 of the marshal's horse carriages. Napoleon, his generals, and his aides-de-camp shared the carriages and had an escort composed of 300 rallied soldiers to serve as their bodyguards. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the procession headed south to the city of Lyon, which was 77 miles northeast of Paris. Napoleon slept throughout much of the day-long journey. Whenever his convoy halted along the route, at towns and to obtain fresh horses, the locals sometimes recognized him and shouted out, "Long live the Emperor!" In spite of Napoleon's dismal outlook on immediate concerns, a different reality preceded him. In recent days, the general mood in Paris was positive. Ahead of hearing of the defeat at Waterloo, the Parisian politicians and population were recently receiving other news of French military victories. In the northwestern regions of France, the royalist armed rebellions were being gradually suppressed by Napoleon's troops in the Army of the West, under General Lamarque. Along the French borders in the southwest, the emperor's regional armies were capturing enemy-held territories. Most significant of all, was the official bulletin reporting Napoleon's victory over the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny. All of these reports in rapid succession spread enthusiasm across the capital. Napoleon and his entourage arrived in Lyon at 6 o'clock in the evening. Here, the emperor gave out further orders for his troops to fall back from Philippeville and rally instead at Lyon. Napoleon had his mind set on staying at this site and personally rebuilding his army. But he was strenuously urged by his staff to make haste in returning to Paris instead. In their opinions, Napoleon had to quickly confront the politicians there to prevent any political anarchy once news of the army's decisive defeat at Waterloo had reached them. Despite his desire to stay at Lyon, he gave in to the pleas to rush to the capital. But he intended to come back within the week. While preparing to leave, he bitterly complained, "I'm convinced that I am being made to do something stupid. My real place is here." Before leaving, Napoleon dictated a detailed bulletin of the Battle of Mont-Saint-Jean, which was his own reference to the Battle of Waterloo. At 9 o'clock, in the darkness, Napoleon settled into a horse-drawn caleche and left Lyon and continued onwards to Paris. In the meantime, important events were unfolding around the French army and close to the French capital. The reinforced armies of Wellington and Blucher were marching in parallel directions, pressing forward with speed south, with the intention of capturing Paris and not letting the broken French army have time to rally. The Allied commanders were resolved to bring an early end to the war. The Prussians had split their own army movements. The main body moved in conjunction with Wellington's army towards Paris. On its left, a wing of 2 Prussian corps were in pursuit of the isolated right wing of the French army, led by Marshal Grouchy, who had wisely chosen to retreat rapidly after hearing about Napoleon's catastrophic defeat at Waterloo. From June 19, Grouchy conducted a magnificent fighting retreat back to the French border. By nightfall of the 20th, all his troops had successfully crossed over the Sambre River. At the town of Nemière, arriving back in French territory, largely intact, bringing all their wounded and wagons. Grouchy then led his 25,000 troops to rejoin the main French army that was reassembling at Lyon. when Napoleon had escaped from his exile on the island of Elba, and successfully reclaimed power in Paris, the ousted King of France, Louis XVIII, fled from Paris and relocated his court in neighboring Belgium. The king had only been ruling in France since the spring of 1814, and during his reign of the First Restoration, the French rulers and citizens existed through a new constitutional monarchy, with its legislated articles arranged in the nation's Charter of 1814. While Napoleon re-established himself in Paris, he began to lay the foundations of a new, more liberal system of leadership. He understood the new liberated political climate of France would not return the nation to being governed by a dictatorship. A month after being back in power, the new Charter of 1815 was agreed upon in April of that year, between Napoleon and the nation's political leaders. In large part, this legislation was mostly similar to its predecessor, the Charter of 1814. As such, it was commonly referred to as the Additional Act, which was written by the former outspoken opponent of Napoleon, and staunchly liberal advocate, Benjamin Constant. While censorship no longer existed, with the war against Europe looming, conscription, which was halted in the 1814 Charter, was once again permitted. The Additional Act formally recognized France being ruled as a constitutional monarchy. In early June, the creation of the new order of rule and governance for France, under Napoleon's leadership, was officially adopted and heralded by the Champ de Mai celebration. The massive public spectacle and military review held in Paris appealed mostly to the Bonapartists and veteran soldiers in attendance. In general, there was a lack of public enthusiasm surrounding the intention of the event to rouse popularity for the new political system. Indeed, for many citizens, there was not much difference to expect in Napoleon's not-so-spectacular, reshuffled leadership decisions. Napoleon resumed his reign as the dynastic emperor of France, and his state council of ministers and head officials operated under his direction, but within restrictions similar to how the Charter of 1814 structured the French government. As with the 1814 Charter, as head of state, Napoleon had the constitutional power to dissolve the chambers, such as during a national security crisis. A new significant directive was also created. The French nation would not accept a return of the Bourbon monarchy as its ruler. This meant that Napoleon's dynasty would continue on, through his son, if ever his own reign had ended. Napoleon brought back several of his former reliable officials to serve in his new council, such as the long-serving Minister of Justice, Cambacérès, and also the multi-talented Secretary of State, the Duke of Basneau. The new powers of Napoleon and his government body were counterbalanced by the two chambers of the French Assembly, which consisted of hundreds of appointed and elected officials. The upper chamber, also known as the Chamber of Peers, was comprised of officials who held their seats as hereditary members, and were appointed by Napoleon himself. His brothers, Lucien and Joseph, being deemed princes in the imperial family, were also peers by right. Collectively, the peers were a unified and stable entity, which could be expected to be supportive of Napoleon. They also had the power to initiate trials of accused prominent officials and military commanders, under certain conditions. The lower chamber, referred to as the Chamber of Representatives, had 629 seats. During the former reign of King Louis XVIII, this body was formally referred to as the Chamber of Deputies. The members were regionally elected officials from the French departments, and were grouped among the three parties operating in this chamber. The overwhelming majority were liberals, numbering 510 seats. The Bonapartist faction, and the revolutionary Jacobins, occupied the remaining seats. Although none of these groups favored the former Bourbon king nor its former monarchy reign, there were several dedicated liberals, who alongside a number of Jacobin members, who were cautious of Napoleon, and ready to oppose him if they felt he strayed beyond his designated leadership mandate. The leader of the Liberal Party was none other than the Marquis de Lafayette. Ever since Napoleon rose to power, Lafayette had refused offers to be a member of his imperial government. This was despite the fact that 15 years earlier, Napoleon had won Lafayette's freedom from captivity in enemy hands. Lafayette made no secret of his opposition to Napoleon's reign, and he chose to keep himself outside of politics, and lead a quiet, secluded life in the French countryside. But then, with the passing of the more liberal-purposed Charter of 1815, Lafayette came out of obscurity, and became an elected representative of the chambers. As if destiny had repeatedly called upon this man to play significant roles in major historic events, as he had done during the American and French revolutions, he was about to be a main player in the shaping of the end of an epic European era. Napoleon Bonaparte was known as a dedicated revolutionary, but his loyalty was undisputedly towards his brother Napoleon. The ministers were permitted to be present at the Assembly Chambers sessions. The Chambers sessions were open to the public, except for special occasions when secret meetings could be held. Nonetheless, opposition against Napoleon's new reign had violently erupted in the middle of May, when defiant royalists of the Vendée, in the west of France, launched an open rebellion. Even worse than this hostile outbreak, Napoleon was about to face a more ominous threat to his reign. It would come from within. Before Napoleon left Paris to launch his army's military campaign in Belgium, he left behind what he considered to be a strong enough government, with trusted, long-serving ministers and staff in charge of keeping France politically stable during his absence. He entrusted the Minister of War post to the reliable and stern commander, Marshal Davout, who was not pleased with being left out of the upcoming campaign. Though his talents as a battlefield general were going to be sorely missed, his appointed role was essential to keeping France secure under his reputed no-nonsense leadership. In contrast, Napoleon reluctantly felt obliged to keep on as his Minister of Police, the very capable but notoriously deceitful Joseph Fouché, someone with a murderous history of casually orchestrating horrific mass executions of French civilians during the French Revolution. The Emperor and Fouché were well associated with each other, being allies in the 1799 coup d'état, the 18 Brumaire event. Napoleon rewarded Fouché for his role by having him in his service during the First Empire, effectively organizing the French secret police as a feared iron hand against the emperor's dissenters. The arrangement had many ups and downs, due to Fouché's consistent habit of deviously acting for the sake of his own ambitious schemes. Shortly after reclaiming the throne, Napoleon had suspected Fouché of being involved in an intrigue with Austrian officials, which sparked a one-sided angry confrontation between the two. Napoleon raged and berated Fouché, accusing him of being a traitor to his face. Fouché was unoffended and casually disregarded the incident. Right after, when he left Napoleon in his room, he smugly remarked to one staff member outside, who overheard the verbal tirade, "He hasn't changed." Despite his serious misgivings, Napoleon chose to dare not remove Fouché from his minister position. A combination of reasons may have influenced Napoleon's gamble to keep Fouché in his post. The controversial minister was very accomplished in policing national security. The removal of such a prominent official could cause a sensational scandal, one that could weaken Napoleon's government. Making an enemy out of Fouché would be a dangerous option, as underhanded retaliation would surely result at some point. Even prior to Napoleon's invasion of Belgium, Fouché had quietly predicted that the bold military adventure would be ultimately doomed to fail, after achieving one or two victories. With that firm belief in mind, Fouché was already determined not to be caught unprepared. One person Napoleon had faith in was his brother, Joseph, who was now acting in the role of an envoy to Napoleon's Council of State in Paris. By the early morning of June 20, Joseph had received Napoleon's letters that were written and sent out just the day before, from Philippeville. Joseph read through the message contents that described the shocking French military disaster suffered at Waterloo. Following the letter's other directives, with specific instructions Napoleon had entrusted him to carry out, Joseph lost no time in calling together a council of the ministers, and informing them of the news of the defeat, and also impressing upon them the expectation from their emperor, which urged them to remain strong together and support his efforts to rebuild the army. The council showed its willingness to do just that. That is, all except for one culprit among them, who, while acting in agreement with his colleagues, set about right after the council meeting was over, to begin clandestinely undermining and destroying whatever patriotism that Napoleon's supporters tried to muster in Paris, on behalf of the emperor. The dishonorable backstabber was none other than Fouché. He sought to entice a few key participants, in order for his new mastermind plot to succeed. He knew that several particular members among the chambers of representatives were susceptible to becoming his unwitting and willing accomplices, upon their receiving news of the French army's decisive defeat at Waterloo. Using this ominous situation now facing France, Fouché set his duplicitous plans into motion to propel the downfall of the Emperor of France, and eventually promote his own ambitious aim to lead a subsequent French government. In his first bold move, Fouché quietly arranged the release of Eugene d'Arnoul, the Baron of Vitrolles, who Napoleon had arrested and imprisoned in Paris, 2 months earlier, in the middle of April, for organizing royalist resistance against him, in the Toulouse area. Baron Vitrolles had also taken part, as an officer, in the victory of royalist troops over those loyal to Napoleon, in a significant clash, at Loriol, in southern France. An understanding was established between the two, whereby Vitrolles would lay low and close at hand during his freedom, until eventually called upon by Fouché to act as his envoy for discreet discussions with the Bourbons. Fouché spent the later day of June 20 and then going into the overnight hours, conducting secretive one-on-one personal interviews with specific susceptible ministers and members of the two chambers. The mastermind was setting the stage for a dramatic showdown that on face value would not appear to be a provocative act of rebellion or treason, but instead, an orchestrated build-up of insurmountable political opposition against Napoleon, and to resolve the grave national security crisis. Fouché aimed to control the resistance from the chambers, to avoid provoking a violent reaction from Napoleon's ministers, in particular, Marshal Davout. Although the war minister probably had other distractions at the same time, with his wife who was then 8 months pregnant. Among the selected representatives, with whom Fouché had conversations with, were, the Liberal Party leader, Lafayette, and 2 other officials Fouché was already personally acquainted with. The young Monsieur J. and Monsieur Mandel. Fouché lured these persons into the belief that they were among the very few representatives who could be trusted to speak out against Napoleon, as being a harbinger of doom. To inspire his co-conspirators' wrath against Napoleon, Fouché spoke out with his own condemnations. The reckless gambler has lost the art of winning. During the day of the 20th, the members in the Chamber of Representatives were predictably in an uproar upon the revelation of the horrendous news of the French army's near obliteration in Napoleon's short-lived campaign. The Chambers of Representatives President, Chandonny Longueuil, was very concerned. He was a dedicated Republican, and formerly the President of the French National Assembly during the midst of the Revolution. He then became a long-time outspoken critic of Napoleon's reign for over a decade. In early June, the Chamber of Representatives elected Longueuil to be its president. When Napoleon received this news, he flew into a rage, which was typical whenever he regarded himself as a victim of an unexpected betrayal. During his outburst, Napoleon exclaimed to his staff around him, "They wish to insult me by electing an enemy." He made a vicious threat to shut down the chamber, before being finally calmed down by those around him. Although the new constitution did allow Napoleon to approve or deny the chamber's choice of president, Napoleon did confirm the result, after having a mutually cordial meeting with Longueuil. Even still, Fouché exploited a fresh opportunity, as he quickly spread gossip of Napoleon's initial shutdown threat, desiring to agitate the representatives' fears of Napoleon striking against them. And so, 2 weeks after he gave assurances to Napoleon, towards a sincere collaborative understanding between them, the now formidable representatives' president began to reconsider his initial cooperative stance. The malicious gossip circulated by Fouché began taking an amplified effect. Throughout both chambers in the Legislative Assembly, the members' willingness to sacrifice Napoleon slowly became a growing reality, while at the same time, they convinced themselves that there would be no return of the Bourbons to replace the emperor. A somewhat near repeat of Napoleon's first downfall in 1814 was taking shape once again. The first stage of Fouché's devious plan was well underway. It was 5:30 in the morning, when Napoleon finally arrived back in Paris. He made his way to the Élysée Palace, looking disheveled, tired, and breathing with some difficulty. Although the past week of intense campaigning had taken its toll upon Napoleon's stamina, the French emperor was still energetic, preparing to appeal for more sacrifices from France. Arriving at the palace, Napoleon was first greeted by his good friend and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Armand Cour. Relaxing himself on a sofa, Napoleon remarked, "The thing was won, the army had performed miracles. Then, at the end of the day, a panic seizes them. I can't understand it." Ney went in, like a lunatic. He slaughtered all my cavalry. There's no more to say. I need 2 hours of sleep to enable me to set about business. Displaying some anguish, Napoleon clutched at his chest, expressing that he felt as if he was choking. When Napoleon inquired about the mood of the politicians, Cole and Corps confessed that many of them were against continuing the war. Napoleon still expressed his intent to conduct a Council of State session, and to also rally the two government chambers bodies. The more formidable challenges he expected to face would come from the unpredictable chambers of representatives, rather than from the more sedate chambers of peers members, each of whom he handpicked himself. Napoleon intended to win over all of them to gain their full support. They would be his last chance to turn around the stunning defeat into a near impossible far-fetched triumph. Cole and Corps remained unconvinced of the emperor's high hopes, further explaining to Napoleon, "News of your disasters has already transpired. The chamber will not act agreeably to your expectations. I'm sorry to see you in Paris, sire. It would have been better not to leave the army. That is where your strength lies and your safety." Napoleon then soberly confessed, "But I have no army left. I have nothing but fugitives. I've no guns." However, with unanimity, everything may be repaired. Count Lavalette, the French nation's general director of posts, and a good friend of the emperor, showed up at this time. Napoleon greeted him with a momentary breakdown, in the form of an exasperated laughing fit, before composing himself, and then inquiring further, about the political situation. Lavalette emphasized the dire prevailing mood among the representatives, and how much of their ongoing discussions were fixated upon the possibility of requiring Napoleon to abdicate, to resolve the national crisis. Not long after, Napoleon had rested and was refreshing himself, and while he was taking a bath, the Minister of War, Marshal Davout, also arrived to present himself and his own report of the state of affairs in Paris. Davout strongly suggested to Napoleon that the Assembly of Representatives should be immediately dissolved. Napoleon rebuffed the idea, declaring that he was still committed to acting within reason, as their constitutionally appointed ruler. But in fact, not 2 weeks earlier, prior to Napoleon leaving Paris to lead his army, he had debated with himself, on the point of whether to use his constitutional right to shut down the chambers while he was absent. He yielded to using restraint, despite his justifiable doubts. Napoleon went to his summoned council meeting, which commenced at 10 o'clock that morning. Among those present were his important ministers, his brothers, several generals, and many other officials in his Council of State. Napoleon's loyal secretary, Murat, the Duke of Bazeneau, commenced the meeting by reading out aloud Napoleon's bulletin that he had dictated while at Philippeville, describing the battle at Mont-Saint-Jean in detail, which also alluded to Marshal Ney being at some fault for the defeat. Napoleon then gave a patriotic speech to the audience, calling upon everyone to rally around him, and to continue the war, which he had started the week before. Among his choice words, spoken to the silenced and brooding listeners, "Our misfortunes are great. I have come to repair them, to impress upon the nation a great and noble devotion. The enemy will be crushed. I could seize power. But it would be more useful, and more national, if it were given by the chambers." Napoleon let it be known to his loyal followers in the council that he would challenge the chamber's officials to unite with him by choice, rather than intimidate, or even dispose of their own powers altogether. The council wholly agreed on the necessity to gain favor with the members of the chambers. Napoleon then invited the council to openly express their opinions. However, only a few of the prominent persons among them did speak their minds. Minister of Foreign Affairs, Cole and Corps, calmly proposed for a national effort to support Napoleon and continue the war. Minister of the Interior, Carnot, became emotionally moved, calling for the National Guard and militias to be mobilized and Paris to be placed under a state of siege. He further ventured that the chambers should be persuaded to position Napoleon in the role of a dictator. Minister of War, Davout, was more direct with his opinion. He maintained that negotiating with the chambers' assemblies would be a waste of time. He cited the specific article in the 1815 Additional Act, which would allow Napoleon to dissolve the chambers. Napoleon's brother Lucien strongly agreed with Marshal Davout. Although these two once very close brothers had an eventual falling out between themselves over the years, Lucien now presented a shadow of his former revolutionary self, seeking a repeat of the 18 Brumaire event, in which he played a prominent role in securing Napoleon's ambition to become sole leader of France. Once again, He believed that the chambers needed to be rendered powerless, even if by force. Napoleon pushed back against the insidious advice. The nation did not send them to overthrow me, but to support me. I do not fear them. I shall still be the idol of the people and of the army. Were I to say a single word, they would be all knocked on the head. If we quarrel, instead of preserving a good understanding with each other, all will be lost. Adding his own concerns, Minister of the Navy, Admiral de Craye, who was also a member of the Chamber of Peers, reasoned that the Chambers of Representatives could not be trusted to support Napoleon during the current crisis. He noted their current hostile mannerisms. At this juncture, the Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, now seized his opportunity to prey upon Napoleon's hesitancy to act aggressively. He postured himself calmly and positively, to contrast himself from his disgruntled colleagues, and their predominantly dire commentaries. He encouraged Napoleon to approach the chambers in good faith. Fouché likely calculated that this passive overture would make Napoleon appear weak to his critics in the representatives' chamber, and not someone to be feared, as was the case for 14 years, up until his exile to Elba. In accordance with his devious scheming, Fouché was carefully prodding the unsuspecting emperor straight into his trap. Vice President of the Council of State, Count Regnault, a solid supporter of liberal ideals, then added his own bold and startling viewpoint. He maintained that the Chambers of Representatives were in such a mood of despair that their only belief in the salvation of France rested upon Napoleon's abdication in favor of his son, and his distanced Austrian wife, Marie-Louise, taking over the French throne. This he further believed should at least satisfy the enemy coalition's leaders. The statement was too brazen for Napoleon to ignore. He responded with vigor by defending his own exalted reputation, which still existed with his loyal French army troops, who were rallying in greater numbers by the hour, in the Lone region. Other passionate supporters included the growing mobs of excitable fédéré militiamen, loitering in and around Paris, who were openly voicing their own devotion for the emperor. Further deliberations then continued in the council, when suddenly, in the next moment, the meeting received a shocking interruption. It was as if the sky itself had just dropped on their heads. Upon learning that Napoleon was soon returning to Paris, the politicians of the Chamber of Representatives had gathered at their assembly hall, several hours before their doors were due to open at noon. Time was now of the essence. Fouché's recruited partners were among them, acting as his fearmongers. His calculated exaggerated rumors of a wrathful emperor returning to retake total control in the capital worked up the representatives into a boiling rage. This was the ongoing anarchy that Napoleon was warned about by his staff members, almost as soon as he had arrived back in Paris. The representatives had started their own assembly meeting by the time Napoleon's council was in session. The boldest among the representatives, being the liberals, revealed their true colors. They wanted to be free and independent as a nation, dispensing with the dynasties of the Bourbons and for some, even that of Napoleon. They feared any delay in their actions to assert themselves would allow Napoleon the opportunity to strike at them first, by dissolving the chambers. The more moderate voices of reason in the chamber sought to persuade Napoleon to voluntarily abdicate in favor of his son. The new ruler of France, by name, would be the boy, Napoleon II. Even though he was being confined in Austria, along with his mother, still the French empress. More radical suggestions were offered, circumventing the constitution, and forcing Napoleon to abdicate by their decree. This was the farce that Fouché was engineering ever so carefully. He patiently manipulated his players and the played upon, putting them all on a basis of false footings. Even while he was attending the meeting, at the Élysée Palace, Fouché discreetly communicated messages to the agitated representatives. The distance between the two meeting halls was quite close, separated only by the River Seine. Fouché's latest dispatch of manipulative news claimed that Napoleon was in the council, preparing to imminently dissolve the chambers. This new alarm was too menacing to ignore. The representatives deliberated with vigor upon the three options remaining to act upon. The first, being desirable to the small but still significant Bonapartist faction, would compel the chamber to fully support Napoleon, in a dutiful and patriotic effort, resulting in the ultimate defeat of the Allied armies. The second, which appealed to the minority of revolutionaries, would have the chamber resist any attempt by Napoleon to use his constitutional right to dissolve the chambers legally, and keeping power for himself. for the duration of the current national crisis. The third, agreeable to the liberal majority, would be to use their numbers and vote for proposals that would oblige Napoleon to give up his throne, as the means to convince the Allied powers to cease their invasion plans and discuss peace terms, the goal being to keep France independent and liberal in its politics. Fouché's unwitting main player, Lafayette, seized upon this turbulent moment to launch a well-prepared and quite drastic crusade. He made a sensational appeal to the frantic members surrounding him. They became silent as he gave guidance. "Gentlemen, I feel myself called on to speak to you of the dangers that threaten the country," he declared to the audience, a statement with 5 proposals. The opening one simply pointed out the obvious. The Chamber of Representatives declares that the independence of the nation is threatened. The second listed proposal was a defiant challenge against Napoleon, and was an action beyond the Constitution itself. It stated, "The Chamber declares itself in a state of permanence. Any attempt to dissolve it is a crime of high treason. Whoever shall be guilty of such an attempt will be a traitor to his country, and immediately condemned as one." The third initiative was an important message for the French army, reminding them to perform their duty solely in defense of the nation's independence. The Army of the Line and National Guard, who have fought, and still fight, in defense of the liberty, the independence, and the territory of France, have deserved well of their country. The fourth proposal was similar to the third, with its focus appealing to the loyalty of National Guards in Paris. They would protect the Chamber representatives, in the event of a Bonapartist coup attempt to remove them. The Minister of the Interior is invited to assemble the principal officers of the Parisian National Guard, in order to consult on the means of providing it with arms, and of completing this corps of citizens, whose tried patriotism and zeal offer a sure guarantee for the liberty, prosperity, and tranquility of the capital, and for the inviolability of the national representatives. The fifth and final proposal was a demand made with an impudent tone, adding insult to the injury of the second proposal. The Ministers of War, of Foreign Affairs, of Police, and of the Interior are invited to repair immediately to the sittings of the Chamber. And then, another of Fouché's insider pawns, the representative, Henri Lacoste, another strong critic against Napoleon, spoke up in strong support of Lafayette's proposition. The overwhelming numbers of liberals and revolutionaries backed it as well. By the noon hour, the Chamber of Representatives had formally adopted all of Lafayette's resolutions. Self-congratulating applause erupted among them. It was these official proposals that were immediately sent by letter to Napoleon's council. As an extra precaution, the representatives had posted more National Guards around their assembly building. A copy of this momentous letter was then dispatched to the Luxembourg Palace, where the Chamber of Peers was also in session. Fouché, and the anti-Bonapartist representatives, now held an advantageous momentum. They each believed that the fate of France was in their own hands. However, it would soon become apparent that events in and around Paris were now racing beyond anyone's control. Napoleon read through the message that had just arrived from the Chambers of Representatives. Then he exclaimed in exasperation to his council audience, "I was right in thinking that I ought to dismiss those fellows before I left. It is all over. They're on the verge of ruining France." The council members were in dismay with the disturbing new turn of events. Napoleon paced up and down, making angry remarks before being finally calmed down. And then, even worse news arrived, coming from the Chamber of Peers. They had just approved of the representatives' resolutions, and surprisingly, also similarly voted to keep their own assembly in permanence too. What little remained of the emperor's authority was now under siege. Napoleon was bewildered, and told the audience, "I do not resist for myself, but for the country. If it needs me no longer, I will abdicate." Davout muttered about the now missed opportunity to shut down the chambers that Napoleon should have promptly acted upon when he was forewarned of this threat, well before the session of the representatives had begun. The elected representatives had far too much public support in their favor. Even still, Lucien tried again to prompt Napoleon to take draconian action, and uttered to his brother the word venture. Napoleon soberly replied, "Alas! I have ventured too much. For Napoleon, there should be no coup d'état, similar to that of the pivotal 18 Brumaire event of 1799. At that time, the French government was very unpopular, with hardly any backing from the public. In the current divisive climate, a civil war could easily break out if Napoleon dared to swiftly close down the hostile legislative assembly. Meanwhile, a small gathering of locals began to appear outside the palace walls, along the Avenue Marigny. There were proud shouts of, "Long live the Emperor!" Napoleon saw them from his palace windows, and gratefully acknowledged them. But under duress now, he had much to contemplate for his next actions. At the same time, the representatives were growing impatient while waiting for Napoleon to reply. But they remained constrained, even voting down a very provocative proposal from one among them, for themselves to take command of the National Guard in Paris. Napoleon received further reports of their growing agitation, and of their threats to decree dethroning him by themselves. Regnault and Murat pressed Napoleon to act quickly, which he did, but only taking a half measure. Instead of sending his ministers to the representatives, Napoleon decided to send out 2 staff officials, one to each chamber at the same time. They were to present his message, explaining that his return to Paris was to simply convene in a council with his ministers, and to confer with the chambers regarding the new national crisis. He also gave assurances that the beaten French army was rebuilding, and that the council was discussing remedies. He added that the defeat suffered in battle at Mont-Saint-Jean was almost a victory until the end. Carnot went to the Chamber of Peers with the message, where it was received calmly. But when Count Regnault delivered the message to the representatives, he was greeted only with open hostility. Fouché had already spread further false news among the chamber, that the Allied powers would accept Napoleon II as ruler of France, only if Napoleon abdicated in his favor. The representatives were anxious to hear from Napoleon, making the decision to concede his own throne. A few even became paranoid, believing Napoleon was preparing to send his soldiers against them. With their patience strained, the representatives indignantly sent Regnault back to Napoleon, with a much more emphatic demand of their earlier call to receive those ministers they had already named. Napoleon finally relented, ordering his ministers, Davout, Caulaincourt, Fouché, and Carnot, to take up the arrogant invitation. And he also sent his brother Lucien with them, to act as his commissioner extraordinaire. His mission involved carrying an imperial message written by Napoleon, which he was to personally read only to the representatives. It was at 6 o'clock that same evening, when the emperor's entourage arrived to meet the waiting chamber's representatives at their assembly hall. Lucien made a special request for a private closed session, involving only a small selection of chamber officials. Thereafter, with much of the chambers cleared out, he then read Napoleon's message. It mentioned the recent battles and called for everyone to rally together. Then, it recommended 3 of Napoleon's chosen ministers, Fouché, Carnot, and Caulaincourt, to join with a committee of 5 assembly members to be appointed by the 2 chambers. And it would be this committee that would negotiate peace terms with the approaching Allied armies' commanders. Lucien proposed further, that only through supporting Napoleon could a victory result, which would bring peace to Europe, and prevent the despised Bourbons from returning to power. He had barely finished, when the representatives erupted in raised voices, as they all began asking questions, towards the imperial officials. Now, Fouché's unwitting accomplices among the representatives, who had prepared themselves for this perfect moment, made bold statements. The young Monsieur J. spoke first, after having gained a complete silence in the chamber hall. With eloquence and firmness in his speech, he first challenged the ministers to look into themselves and asked if they honestly believed France could prevail against the coalition armies, and if it was not Napoleon himself who was preventing peace. After a long moment of no response from the ministers, Fouché gave a statement to lend to the belief that he had no inside connection with the speaker. His evasive reply maintained that he and the ministers were only sent to deliver the imperial message, and had nothing further to say. J continued on about the dangers France faced because of Napoleon, and finished off by appealing to Lucien the revolutionary, to influence Napoleon to voluntarily give up the throne in favor of his son, and save the nation from any further hopeless conflict. Lucien remained defiant, by answering back with statements that implied France being stronger than perceived. He emphasized how fast Napoleon's beaten army was rallying at Lon, and the recent appearance of Marshal Grouchy with 25,000 of his troops in the vicinity. As well, Lucien reminded everyone of the upcoming reinforcements of new troops coming from the National Guard, Marines, Fédérés, conscripts, and regional armies falling back upon the capital. He further boasted of the defensive prowess of Paris and its outlying fortifications. Lucien, strange to be heard above the raised voices in the hall, he expressed yet another patriotic call to duty. Rally, all of you, around the chief. Consider that our safety depends on our union, and that you cannot separate yourselves from the emperor, and abandon him to his enemies, without ruining the state, without being faithless to your oaths, without tarnishing forever the national honor. It was then that Ministers Davout and Caulaincourt added their opinions, intending to shift back the focus on the approaching Allied armies, mentioning a needed peace process, and the enemy's threat to the French government. These items subdued most of the flaring tempers. But then, Lafayette made a stinging rebuke directed at Lucien. You accuse us of failure in our duty towards our honor and towards Napoleon. Posterity will not blame France for abandoning Napoleon, but alas, for having obeyed him too long. By what right do you dare accuse the nation of want of perseverance in the emperor's interest? Have you forgotten all that we've done for him? The nation has followed him on the fields of Italy, across the sands of Egypt, the plains of Germany, and across the frozen wastelands of Russia. The nation has followed him in 50 battles, in his defeats and in his victories. And in doing so, we have to mourn the blood of 3 million Frenchmen. Among those in agreement were Monsieur Manuel. In opposition, the Bonapartists argued in favor of Napoleon. For the second time that day, Monsieur Lacoste, Fouché's other pawn, stole the audience's attention once again, which momentarily ceased in its squabbling. Lacoste faced Napoleon's chosen men, and demanded, "Ministers of Napoleon, you talk to us of the national independence. You talk to us of peace. But what new basis will you give to your negotiations? You know, as well as we, that Europe has declared war against Napoleon alone. I declare that I see but one man between us and peace. Let him speak, and the country will be saved." There was much more debating, until there was an agreement to go along with the recommendation in the imperial message, related to the formation of a special committee. The Assembly of Representatives would form its own task force, a commission of 5 members, that would consult in league with the Council of Ministers. Lucien then rushed to the Chamber of Peers, and read to them the same imperial message, whereupon, without any fuss, they also formed their own commission, consisting of 6 of their members. Both commissions were to meet that night, at the Tuileries Palace, together with Napoleon's ministers of state and those with portfolios. They would discuss their proposals and remedies related to the situation of France. Their decisions would then be communicated by the commissions to both of their respective chambers on the next day, for further scrutiny. Lucien then returned to the Élysée Palace, where he soon updated Napoleon on the desperate situation that had just unfolded among the representatives. Both brothers agreed that these volatile members held an influential power that was now too formidable to overcome. Ministers Caulaincourt and Maret also interceded with their observations of the representatives' dangerous self-assertiveness, and they advised Napoleon to yield, and resolved to abdicate in favor of his son, on his own terms, while he still had the chance. It was at 11 o'clock that night, when the conference between Napoleon's ministers and the Assembly Commissions gathered in the Council of State Hall, at the Tuileries Palace, to begin their late-night session. Lucien was present again. 3 prominent issues were dealt with, and would be voted upon. First, the priority of keeping France safe, by using a properly supported military to maintain it. The topics of resources for carrying on a war, such as the nation's financial status, and laws to deter civil strife, were also raised. Draconian ideas were even considered, including suspending some civil rights. Second, how best to negotiate for peace, instead of fighting for it. Lafayette's brazen proposal to force Napoleon to abdicate was supported by the representatives' president, Longuenet, but ultimately it was not carried by most who were present, and was bluntly put aside by the Chancellor, Cambacérès. They resolved to negotiate with the enemy, on the basis of showing a strong national unity. The method of forming a team of peace negotiators, which would approach the coalition commanders, was also decided upon. However, they determined that the talks would be in their name only. Napoleon would be entirely excluded from the process. Third, the ministers of state would sufficiently supply the required troops, horses, and finances necessary to suppress threats posed by domestic enemies. Lucien calmly agreed with the demands, as did most members. Lafayette was not satisfied because there was no actual commitment made, specifically obliging Napoleon to relinquish his throne. Even the word abdication was not included in their decided proposals, although the general impression among everyone was that Napoleon by now had certainly committed towards going through with that ultimate act. The sticking issue remaining for all concerned was when. The proposals were approved by a vote of 16 in favor versus 5 against. The committee members were now operating in a manner beyond the limits of the Constitution. Collectively, they were now acting as if they were already the new rulers of France. Lucien made it known that Napoleon would be prepared to sacrifice his crown for France. But there was no agreement with his suggestion that this should be delayed until after their initial peace talks with the Allied leaders. Finally, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the fatigued officials of the commission concluded their debating for the night, they decided to convey their proposals, with reports sent to both chambers, and to Napoleon. The ministers would bring it to Napoleon that night. General Grenier would give his report to the Chamber of Representatives in the morning. But the ministers, and Count Regnault, obliged him to inform the chamber that there would be a delay of several hours in their receiving an official response from the emperor, who would need to dwell on the historic decision. Assurances were to be made by Grenier that the impending decree would satisfy the representatives, whose sole desire now was for the emperor himself to declare his own abdication, without the need of themselves forcing it upon him. While the committee talks were taking place, Napoleon was in the Élysée Palace, having sobering conversations with his staff members. La Valette and Savary, the Duke of Rovigo, advised him to simply leave France to its own fate, and to retire in America. He also had a sincere talk with Benjamin Constant, of all people, discussing his dilemma, and the difficult choice between sacrificing his throne under political pressure, or stubbornly remaining the leader of France. Napoleon was still unconvinced that all was lost. The crowd of supporters outside the palace was still growing, and there were tens of thousands of loyal soldiers in nearby regions at his disposal. Indeed, they were ready for him to return and command them once again. It was early in the morning, at 9 o'clock, when the Chamber of Representatives began their historic session. Collectively, the members were in a very volatile state of mind. General Grenier, accompanied by Regnault, finally showed up to meet them at 10 o'clock, to give them the report that had been issued from the recent committee meeting. He first ran through the proposals that were voted in favor of by the committee. Then, he advised them to wait for the imperial message promised by Napoleon, with no specifics to its contents, other than that it would declare what they were eagerly anticipating to hear. Not surprisingly, most of the representatives were in no mood to be stalled, and their anger grew by the minute. Grenier felt helpless, as he could no longer appease them. When Regnault saw the unfolding anarchy, during which some members were proposing an enforcement of Napoleon's abdication by themselves, he rushed to the Élysée Palace, to report the desperate situation directly to the emperor. In the meantime, Count La Valette was at the palace in conversation with Napoleon, who had to be convinced that there was no hope of avoiding the inevitable, and he emphasized, "The coup d'état of the 18th Brumaire cannot be repeated." To which Napoleon answered, "That thought is far from my mind." And then Regnault arrived. Napoleon painfully listened to the first-hand account of the Chamber of Representatives breaking down into open hostility against him. The emperor reacted with disgust, and even contemplated not offering to abdicate, and insinuated he still had time to dissolve the chamber, which he deemed as filled with fanatics and ambitious men. He paced about in a fury, and grumbled incoherently. La Valette heard him mention preferring death before abdicating. Regnault appealed to Napoleon to commit himself to being remembered for peace in France through his self-sacrifice, as he did a year earlier. Napoleon replied that he was determined to abdicate, but only after calmly thinking about it. He then sent Regnault back to the chamber, to once again inform the representatives to wait for the imminent message. However, it was not arriving soon enough, and the representatives began losing all control. Fouché's pawns among them stoked paranoid fears of the French army plotting to overthrow the chamber, in support of the emperor. Then, Marshal Davout, sent by Napoleon, arrived in the chambers to report that Marshal Grouchy had escaped from Belgium, with 25,000 of his troops. This meant that the French army, that was reorganizing under the command of Marshal Soult and Jérôme, in the area of Lone and Philippeville, now numbered a fairly impressive estimated total of 60,000 troops. Napoleon had the belief that this positive news would soften the politicians' moods of despair. But in fact, it had the opposite effect. A new scare was triggered among some of the representatives. They envisioned Napoleon promptly leaving Paris, to retake command of the revitalized army, and then continuing the war. And in so doing, perhaps he would ignore, or even shut down the chambers, and of course, dismiss all thoughts of abdicating. Contempt among the liberals in the chamber reached a crescendo. Lafayette, and even the emperor's distinguished officer, General Sebastiani, were among those determined to act without further postponement, and press forward with imposing the abdication of Napoleon by decree. But out of the great disturbance, the representative, Monsieur Antoine Duchesne, halted the chaotic commotion in its tracks. He urged everyone to act with prudence, and cautioned upon the wise necessity to wait for the overdue imperial message. And then another former French general, Solignac, spoke in favor of the proposal. Even though his service history with the emperor was tarnished due to accusations of financial scandals, he did actually have a lengthy association with Napoleon. Now, Solignac argued favorably on behalf of his longtime chief, imploring the members to allow Napoleon at least 1 hour more to submit his throne with some dignity by himself. Gentlemen, we all wish to save our country, but can we not reconcile this unanimous sentiment with the laudable desire that the chamber should preserve the honor of the head of the state? Waiting later today, or tomorrow, would be justifiably cause for argument. But to wait just 1 hour? His honorable intervention finally succeeded in subduing the hundreds of frustrated members around him, and they agreed with his plea. In unison, they all began shouting, "1 more hour! An hour!" Solignac and several representatives bolted into action, and lost no time in quickly proceeding to the Élysée Palace to meet with Napoleon. Their paramount mission was to hasten the delivery of the imperial message. The meeting was emotional. Solignac had been under General Bonaparte's command 20 years earlier, when he defended the government in Paris during the insurrection attempt of the 13 Vendémiaire, and again, when he led grenadiers to protect Napoleon during the momentous coup d'état of the 18th Brumaire. Solignac was now witness to yet another epic moment in Napoleon's life, but this time being his unavoidable downfall. Napoleon assured his ex-general that the abdication was duly forthcoming. They took a walk into the palace garden, where just beyond, crowds of Napoleon's supporters called out, "Long live the emperor!" Napoleon made some small talk, complaining about the assembly chamber's recent misadventures, and their simplistic belief that, upon his departure they would lead the nation themselves. He noted their denial of the realistic likelihood of the Bourbons returning to power, backed by the invading coalition armies. Not doubting the validity of such a judgment, Solignac was moved to tears. He and his colleagues were then sent away by Napoleon, with another promise of the long-awaited official announcement that the French government in Paris was expecting. Napoleon's loyal soldiers, while confidently rallying in strength, in expectation he would be back within days to take lead of them once again, were ignorant of the ongoing leadership crisis in Paris. Napoleon then attempted to write the abdication himself. He stopped after a few sentences. Close at hand were Lucien and Joseph, and Regnault, who all advised that the abdication letter should stress that the relinquished throne would go to his son. Napoleon's reacted with a venomous sarcastic reply. "What a twisted delusion! No, it's not in favor of my son, but of the Bourbons that I abdicate. They at least are not prisoners in Vienna." And at this historic moment, Napoleon summoned Lucien to formally write the abdication, while he dictated the long-anticipated statement himself. Declaration to the French people. People of France. In commencing a war, to maintain the independence of the nation, I was counting on the joint efforts of all, and unanimity of all, and the support of all the national authorities. From these, I had reason to hope for success. And braved all the declarations of the Allied powers, lined up against me. Circumstances appear to me, to have changed. I offer myself in sacrifice, to the animosity of the enemies of France. May they prove themselves to be sincere in their declarations, and really only hold a grudge against my person. My political life is at an end. And I proclaim my son, under the title Napoleon II, Emperor of the French. The current ministers will form the Provisional Governing Council. The interest I take in my son, leads me to invite the chambers, to organize the regency, without delay, by law. Unite, all of you, for public safety, and to remain an independent nation. This was signed, at 12:30 in the afternoon. Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer the Emperor of France. With all speed, ministers, Fouché, Caulaincourt, and Decrès took one copy of the abdication declaration to the Chamber of Representatives. At the same time, the ministers Carnot, Moulin, Gaudin, rushed to bring the other copy to the Chamber of the Peers. The Chamber of Representatives received the arrival of the ministers sent to them, at 1 o'clock. President Longueuil read the declaration letter aloud to the members. The representatives lost no time in discussing the next stage of forming an interim governing body, through the creation of a new executive commission, composed of 3 of their own members, and 2 from the peers. For themselves, they elected Carnot, Fouché, and Grenier. A report detailing their affirmation of the abdication, and the results of their voted appointments, was sent by Fouché, to the Chamber of Peers Assembly. At this time, the peers were in the midst of their own uproar. One of the peers present, was none other than Marshal Ney. He had taken it upon himself to abandon the army and represent himself among his fellow peers. Ney was on a personal mission, to defend his reputation, because he felt victimized by Napoleon's bulletin of the battle on June 18, which mentioned undesirable references, that put some blame upon him for the defeat. His own shorter written account of the battle, in which he described his own actions, and the French army's day-long bravery, had already been sent ahead to the chamber. Ney contradicted any positive reports that the peers were receiving from Napoleon and his ministers. He lamented on how, even though the army did its duty, all was lost. He downplayed the optimistic news from Marshal Davout, which confirmed that 60,000 French soldiers had rallied so far. Ney insisted that only half that many actually existed. Arguing burst out among the peers, as some sided with or against Ney. Marshal Drouot arrived and settled down the noise. Then Fouché's message from the representatives was brought to them. While the contents were agreeable to most of them, Napoleon's closest supporters, present in the peers' chamber, Lucien, and the devoted idolizers of Napoleon, Generals Labédoyère and Flo, were openly alarmed by one striking singular omission. There was no mention in the representatives' message, of Napoleon abdicating in favor of his son, as the constitution clearly stipulated in the procedure of the Bonaparte dynasty, which had to be passed on, from father to son. However, most of the peers were not adverse to the cunning tactic employed by the representatives. There was a common mood to bypass technicalities swiftly, and move ahead at any cost. But this grievance was not ignored so easily. Back and forth condemnations began. Count Thibaudeau lashed out, calling for Napoleon's immediate abdication, regardless. This sparked fury among the pro-Bonapartist peers. Lucien denounced the troublesome outbursts by reminding the peers that they were appointed by Napoleon, and accordingly, they owed him their gratitude and loyalty. He pointed out how they had to hold true to the Constitution article, related to protecting Napoleon's dynasty. He finished off by stating, "Let us rally around Napoleon II." One peer, Monsieur de Pontécoulon, agreed with the notion of gratitude being owed, but was against the suggestion, by noting that the child was far away with his mother, in Austria, and not returning. He revealed his bitter prejudices, as he heckled Lucien, labeling him a Roman prince, and added, "Besides, by what right does the Prince of Canino come to speak within these walls? Is he a Frenchman?" Lucien fired back, "If you do not consider me a Frenchman, the nation does. Then he added how the emperor's abdication would be nullified if Napoleon II was not made the successor to the throne. Labedouille then stepped in, agreeing with Lucien, and lashed out with a stinging rebuke against those he considered ungrateful, ending off with a scandalous accusation. The traitors have abandoned him. I see some of them on these benches. These malicious words incited an incredible uproar. Count Thibaudot again spoke out, reminding everyone of their laws, related to the Constitution's 67th article on the topic of dynasty. He proposed the Chamber of Peers avoid any discussion related to Napoleon II, at the current time, and simply agree with the Chambers of Representatives' position on moving forward regardless, with having the abdication mandate concluded then and there. It was this reasoning that finally calmed the tensions. The peers moved to confirm and collaborate with the proposals of the representatives. Regarding the request for two of their peers to join the Executive Commission, the Chamber voted for Caulaincourt and Baron Quinet. Back in the Chamber of Representatives, Count Regnault made a small speech that completely silenced the assembly. He suggested the chamber needed to show a token of their appreciation towards Napoleon in person, giving him the respect and gratitude with which they accepted the noble sacrifice he had made to the independence and happiness of the French people. And so, a small deputation from among the representatives then went to the Élysée Palace to visit their former emperor. Napoleon received them with as much dignity as he could bear, even conversing with them calmly. Ignoring their facade of gentle mannerisms towards him, he instead devoted his remaining time with them, in forewarning them of the Allied coalition's ambition to put the Bourbons back in power. He candidly shared his sincere desires with them. My political career is now at an end, and perhaps with it, my life. Wherever I may be, the happiness and the dignity of France shall be my only wish. There is no hope, but in unity among yourselves. The Chamber of Peers sent their own deputation later on to visit Napoleon. Napoleon emphatically reminded them that his sacrifice was for his son. The next day, the chambers would indeed acknowledge his son becoming Napoleon II. But at the same time, they knew that the provisional government they were ready to create would in fact hold the leadership of France, with Fouché as the nominated leader. 7 days earlier, Napoleon had triumphed in his final battlefield victory. He had sent 2 coalition armies running away, with his own fiercely devoted army that was half the size of his opponent's. But then, all these hard-fought gains, which became caught up in a whirlwind of misfortunes and poor decisions, suddenly tumbled into an abyss. For the past 2 long drawn-out days, he had restrained himself from shutting down the chambers, while at the same time tolerating his political enemies' voracious plots to dethrone him. His time had run out. Ultimately, his enemies in Paris relentlessly pounced upon and magnified the disaster, even when it seemed barely recoverable. Without the unity he needed, Napoleon ended his epic journey of greatness.